the Energy Dialogues collaborative interview series. I'm thrilled to have Steve Dieker here, co-founder and chief executive officer of Kairos Aerospace. Steve, you founded Kairos Aerospace to find solutions to global challenges and ultimately settled on methane emissions. Please tell us a little bit more about yourself and about your organization.
Thanks. Well, I'm happy to be here, first off. And as for myself, I did not come out of the oil industry. So I actually came out of the astrophysics industry. My co-founder, Brian Jones, and I were both physicists at Lockheed Martin, working on a variety of projects. And when we decided to start Kairos, the problem that jumped out to us immediately that we could help solve was the new emphasis on methane emissions. Now, this was a few years ago before anybody knew what ESG meant. But it wound up being a very opportune moment for us to do that. The focus on methane emissions just exploded, and we were pretty sure we had a good way to address it. And fundamentally, I think the difference between what we were doing and what a lot of other organizations were doing is that we focused on the economics of methane emissions, and we focused on working with the oil and gas industry. We work with the people who can fix the leaks. And that has worked out very well, both for us and for methane emissions. Our customers who are using our aerial data to find their largest emitters and fix them have in the last year or so reduced more greenhouse gas emissions than Tesla has in its entire existence. And that's just by finding and fixing these very large methane leaks. We've been growing quite a lot, and we've found that focusing on our oil and gas customers and helping them address these challenges in the most efficient way possible has been a real winner for us.
That's fantastic. Thanks for that background. And you mentioned one of the targeted and hot topic words, ESG. Tell me, over the last couple of years, how have you seen the conversation around ESG changing or developing?
Yeah, I don't think this will surprise many people watching this, but it has completely exploded. It went from not being part of the conversation to now being part of every single conversation we have. Before any company starts working with us, we get hit by a lot of ESG questions very quickly. And fortunately, we're in a position to answer those questions. And it really has just changed everything that our customers are doing. Now, people are still worried about all the usual things. They're worried about cost. They're worried about interfering with operations. They're worried about complying with regulations. And those are all still important. Safety, of course, above everything else. But ESG really is the motivating factor behind methane emissions management right now.
And as Kairos is actively supporting these oil and gas operators with their ESG goals, what sort of data is most important when you're talking with your clients?
Yeah, well, that's actually where things get pretty interesting, because when we're talking about ESG goals, what you're talking about is what the sort of investor and finance community are asking for or even demanding. They want data from oil and gas operators as a prerequisite for capital. So this has become something that's very, very important for most executive teams. They need to get their ESG ducks in a row in order to access the capital they need to function as an ongoing concern. So what the investor community is starting to really require is measurements. For the last several decades, when people talk about emissions, they mostly went at that from an estimation strategy. You would count up all of your assets, all of your various pieces of equipment, valves, pumps, pipes, etc., and then you would multiply all of those by an emission factor. And this was a way to estimate emissions across gigantic oil fields with thousands and thousands, tens of thousands of components. But it turns out that's not very accurate. And at best, it serves as sort of a minimum baseline. Most of the research, including ours, into this area shows that those emission factors are sort of understating emissions. And they just allow too much room for sort of personal opinion, basically. Most of the finance ESG teams that we talk to are really focused on measurements. And specifically, they're focused on measurements that allow you to A, show where you are, B, track your progress in reducing emissions, and C, compare yourself to your peers. And fortunately for us, what we do is very large scale methane surveys. So we're in 9 different basins in the United States right now, flying 9 of our units every single day, gathering data over these fields constantly. What that means is we have data for not just our active customers, but for almost everyone in those basins. And that includes the Permian, the DJ, the Eagle Ford, and several others. And what that allows our customers to do then is A, know by measuring exactly what their methane emissions are, B, track them over time because we survey quarterly or even more rapidly in some cases, and then C, know where they are relative to all of the other operators in the area. And now we keep all of that data confidential. We don't disclose specific emission data to anyone but the owners and operators of the assets. But we have anonymized data so that you can show that your company ranks relative to the other companies one way or another and show how you've improved your performance relative to them over time. This gives you a sort of field-wide view of emissions and a field-wide view of how you're doing in the industry. And that's the kind of thing that ESG teams really want to know. And we're finding that this is basically exactly what executives at these companies, at the oil and gas operators, want to know as well. And so it all lines up pretty well. And it's been pretty interesting to see how this data gets used.
Definitely. And you mentioned you're in a bunch of places. Specifically, coming up in October, you'll be speaking on the methane panel at the upcoming Permian Energy Dialogues that we'll be holding in Midland, Texas. Can you give us a little insight on some of the perspective that you just talked about that maybe is a little bit more Permian focused that you'll bring to the panel?
Absolutely. The Permian is where most of our operations are. It's where most of our customers are, which is not surprising. It is, of course, the most active basin in the country. We have a lot of Permian customers, I think over 20 at this point, and we have data on most operators in the Permian. And what we've been able to do is track people's performance over time. One of the things that has become extremely clear is that the role of the so-called super emitters is very, very important. Somewhere around 80% of all the emissions comes from these very large emitters. These are things that are emitting 100 MCF per day or more. And there's not that many of those, but they have an outsized impact on people's emissions. By finding those, you can very rapidly reduce your overall emissions. We are seeing customers who, over the course of a year to a year and a half, have reduced their methane emissions by a factor of 3 or even a factor of 6. And they've done it while having a positive return on investment. In fact, quite a good return on investment. And we have a customer who's recently put out a paper, and this is a Triple Crown. And in their paper, they looked at the payback time for methane LDAR, basically finding and fixing the leaks. And they kept track of the cost of repair as well as the cost of our data. And they found that the payback time for finding and fixing these super emitters was on the order of 5 days. And so that's just a no-brainer. That is the kind of result we're getting in the Permian and the kind of thing that we'll highlight when we talk at the Permian Focused Conference.
Perfect. I know it's a long time coming. We're super excited to finally be going to Midland to see you, our other partners, and of course our attendees, and then have this dialogue that's definitely needed. Steve, thank you so much for joining me today, and we'll see you in October.
Yeah, thanks. I'm really looking forward to seeing people in person.
Absolutely, me as well. Thanks so much.